shaping their perception and perspective of the world. It's located on 24 acres in Ossining, New York, which is in the Hudson Valley in between Tarrytown and Peekskill, if you're familiar. Bethany's facility includes gallery space, a performance space, a dance studio. Bill T. Jones' company has been in that dance studio, which I find to be amazing. Classrooms, studios for local artists, and rooms and studios for artists in Bethany's residency and retreat programs. As we're coming out of COVID, if you're an artist and are looking for some residency space, definitely check out Bethany Arts Community. All right, let's jump into it. I'll provide full bios for Rachel and Marcus before they present, but here's a bit of our personal origin story. We all met in 2006 at a summer retreat hosted by Cave Canem, an arts organization that fosters the growth and development of Black poets. I don't know how they feel about me, but since I've met them, they've been guiding stars for me in how I approach art with wonder, humanity, and joy. I also admire how each of them, in this often competitive world of creative types, manages to build community around them. We met before any of us had published a book of poems, but each of these poets' stars were obviously ascending, and ascend they have. Rachel was also a photographer and visual artist at the time we met, and Marcus seemed to pick up a camera 5 or 6 years ago, if memory serves. So Rachel and Marcus, let's start by fact-checking my origin story. Can you walk us through how you came into your art? What was your journey to becoming a poet and to becoming a photographer? Rachel, you want to start us off?
Sure. First, I just want to say thank you to Bethany community and all of the work and energy and intention and care that you put us all together. Ian, thank you so much. And it's not a small gift to be here today with you and Marcus. I know Cave Canem 2006 gave me a lot of gifts, but you two are really two of the best and brightest gifts in my life. So thank you. Poetry for me and kind of visual art always was in my life since I was like 4 or 5 years old. I really remember the kind of joy and excitement that I had at a very, very young age, where like you give me crayons and a piece of paper and put me somewhere by myself and I would just be in my world. And so, poetry has always just been in my life, and it's a way of living and seeing and being in the world. And the intimacy of it, I think, is an interesting engagement with my identity as a visual artist. So I am a photographer and a mixed media artist, and I've completed a novel which will be out soon. So I just want to experiment and explode genre, and just if I'm interested in it, I'm going to take the risk and try to just see what happens, just show up. So I would say that's kind of, your origin story is on point, on time. And as you mentioned, I know for the three of us, community, Black life, Black art, imagination is really central and just part of how we move in the world. So I'm really feeling that. So thanks.
I think you got all the facts correct, Ian. I do feel, Rachel, I feel like you had 2 books though already in 06.
I think they were lots
tons of amazing poems. I feel like you had books like that, but yeah, I'll just start with Cave Canem, because there's quite a big chance that I would not have met both of you, definitely as soon as I met you right out of grad school, if it weren't for Cave Canem. And I think that it's such a bridge between all the separated states and territories that America has forced upon Black artists. And I think without it, we'd all be kind of lost in our individual territories in some way. So a giant shout out to Cave Canem. Thank you so much to the Bethany Center for having us, Ian for organizing everything and bringing us together. I started writing poetry seriously when I was in undergrad, but my parents were actors, and money was tight, and we didn't have cash for babysitters, so we would always go to their rehearsals, and they were always doing these 20th century, pretty dark, gritty dramas, and I'd get to hear language tried out in a bunch of different ways. And then once I got into college and started reading contemporary poetry, I felt like I found my main art form or my main genre, because I was always very, very shy. I'm still very shy. And I could never have done the theater thing. But with a poem, I felt like I could obsess over multiple drafts by myself and figure out the best words in the best order, as they say. And then I went to grad school for poetry, moved to New York, and just am still doing it and still love to write new drafts, even if they're bad. I try to tell myself that they're good when I'm writing them the first time. Judgment is always for the revision process, which I try to keep separate or spaced out at least a few weeks apart. As far as photos, I got my first really cheap digital camera when my daughter was born in 2013. And then as soon as she could walk, I was watching her every day and adjuncting in the evenings. And as soon as she could walk, we would just be out and about, and I'd be chasing her around trying to get shots. And the more I started doing that and started hitting on some of the shots, I was like, well, I have some free time now. Let me go out in the streets and try to take some street photos. And then that kind of developed more toward the street portraiture side. And to go back to what Rachel was saying about risk, as I mentioned, I'm very shy. And I think taking street photos or forcing yourself to engage with strangers or scenes that aren't necessarily calling you into them, it just helps you break barriers and tap into sectors of humanity and scenes that you normally wouldn't. And that's what I find myself going back to over and over and over. I just love being in the street with a camera.
That's so interesting, because I've often, in some of what I've read about photography, the camera can sometimes seem to be like a barrier, right? Like it's a barrier between the artist and the audience, but you seem to not view it that way. You seem to be saying it like it's an entry point into engagement.
Yeah, for me, because I didn't really find it. I didn't find the medium until I was 35 when it comes to street photos, 36. So, I mean, capitalism just makes you like kind of hone in on whatever your path is. And it just keeps people separate. So for me, it's like I had become so distant from basically my community members, my people, because I'm doing a 9-to-5 gig and raising a child and all that. And then now the camera for me is sort of like that passport back into spaces that I left or was kind of forced to leave.
Mm-hmm. Just to to speak to what Marcus is saying, which is a similar thing. Like I remember in 2006, I mean, I'm still really introverted and shy too. I'm less so than I used to be, but back then it was just almost like crippling sometimes. And I remember, me coming into Cave Canem and looking around and thinking like someone should be like archiving and documenting and making a visual record of who we were and who we are and like, the history, so that someone else doesn't come and try to tell the story or say who we are or how that goes. So instead of thinking like who's going to do that, I thought, well, maybe I'll do it. And so the camera, in a similar way to Marcus, was like I was so overwhelmed in this space of like Black brilliance and joy and community and just and then the rigor of the work, that the camera I think also helped me root myself in the space and feel connected in a way like never before in my life prior to Cave Canem. I was very much like kind of solitary or like really introvert, like a kind of loner. And so as before Cave Canem, I was in the street a lot because I could kind of become very anonymous, and I was very good at like kind of making myself invisible. and I would be in Harlem, or I would be, go to Brooklyn or what, and just like shoot for the day and kind of disappear. And so a thing that has happened since the many years of photographing Kaveh Khanum and other writers and authors now too is like, with like my last book, it became the intimacy though of finally being coming from like the outside world into myself and kind of turning the camera finally on myself. Whereas before I was always making portraits of other people, even though in some ways that is a portrait of yourself. But it took me years and years and years by working and thinking with others and seeing others before I thought like, I need this lens to kind of the reciprocity of it. So I really like what Marcus was saying of like how sometimes just with the living we have, we can get distanced from, ourselves or the way we look, both as poets, but also like as, as photographers, the visual turns into this thing of being in community for sure.
Yeah, the idea of portraiture brings up a question I had for both of you that I see bridging your photographic and poetic work. Both of your photographic repertoires include portraiture, and that seems of a piece with your poetic work. I'm always struck by the intense focus in both of your work on concrete human experiences. So how does capturing the essence of a person and their lived experience with a camera compare to capturing the essence of a person and their lived experience with a pen, so to speak?
Maybe Marcus can go first.
She passed the buck.
Sorry. Marcus, sorry.
Yeah, no, I feel like with a photo, if it hits, at least like in the creation process for me. Whereas like if I miss the photo, if I don't have my focus right, if the lighting's not right, if the subject isn't being their amazing selves and I don't capture it when it happens, then I kind of have to move on and try to make another photo. Whereas with a poem, it's more of a like multi-year sketching process that might not really reveal itself until you've really spent time with it. And it's photos for me, it's kind of like a volume endeavor to where with street photography and street portraits, I'm just trying to take a lot of them, and the ones that after I've given them some time to rest, and they're edited, when I go back and they're still kind of surprising me, then I feel like they're doing what they might be doing or doing what they should be doing. Whereas poems, I still go back to poems that either I've finished or even published, and they're a mystery and they're still kind of moving around. But I think it's like the evolution of language, once it's put down on the page, is going to be constant. So poetry is just more slippery, which kind of makes it a little more, it's just an individual take, I think, for each reader and each poet as the poem ages. But with a photo, it's just something, if something happens within the frame and you are just technically able to get the right things happening with the camera and the lens and the light, then for me, it just feels like it was just handed to me.
Right.
And it feels like luck.
Yeah, I hear you saying there's like an immediacy to photography that there isn't to poetry.
For me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there with what Marcus was saying, and the kind of immediacy is certainly, I think, a distinction between the two. I think more and more as I'm aging, I make less distinction, although I'm aware of the distinction. I think it's, and I think it depends too, kind of like it's very fluid with the photography, right? So like if I'm making a portrait of someone and it's for them, like for their book, or it's in the capital mode of like it's something that is a likeness of them. I think the terms are different than what I might explore as in like not in work mode, so to speak. And yet even when I'm working on portraits, it's really the process. It's a little bit like if you're doing street stuff, it's like you saw it and it was gone. Like you saw it and maybe you got it, or later you don't even know until you're like really at home looking over what your net, like what's in the net that you got, right? That's I feel like that's different than in some ways, like if I'm doing something in the studio and there's lighting and I'm working with a model and like there's a whole kind of dance and intimacy and um there are other things at work that I feel in some way too is similar to the kind of it's like you try to put things down in the poem, and even if you're in a studio and you can have somewhat control, you don't have control either. Like things get revealed, and what you thought you were going to make a photograph of, something else happens with the model or you or what's going on, and everything has to be like realigned. And I think with the poems, they realign and realign and realign because you have the time and the draft and the next draft and the next draft. I mean, I don't know with photographs, sometimes I feel like photographs can be drafts, but it's not really the same. I feel more and more averse to comparing them from my own practice. I also think if I'm making self-portraits, it's a really different thing than being on the street, making an image for someone, or if I have like a series or something I'm doing and it involves like hiring models, storyboarding it, doing like a whole kind of meditation. Photography too, just not to lie, it's much more expensive than poetry. It's hella
It's on a piece of
expensive.
paper, right?
And that's the kind of thing, like to make a proper print, right? Like it's like all this stuff I think about, like, to print to me means what, which is like the poem, we write stuff down, we got journals where, we write it out by hand, where, the tech, it's a different kind of instruments are being tapped there. But I, I don't know. I feel like with my last book, Seeing the Body, I thought, I'm going to put it all in there together. Like it goes together, and I don't want to, I've spent a lot of years being like, here's where the poetry is and here's where the photography is. And for me at this point now, I'm more interested in letting them touch and look at each other than I ever was before. But there are definitely moments where it is not, you know, um, they fail each other or they complement each other. Um, and I also think for me, I have a lot of resistance even in the language of like shooting people or capturing them. I really have to challenge, and this is probably the poet asserting herself. Like, I don't want to take your picture. We're going to make a picture. I don't know. I feel I get real, I don't know, colonizer mood where I don't want to say like I took your picture, I got the shot, I captured. Oftentimes with the portraits, particularly even in the studio, I think I will get to glimpse this. They're going to let me see them or they're not. And usually it's within the first, I want to say maybe 20 minutes. Like there's music on, I'm trying to get to this thing. If I'm photographing poets, I've always read their work, because that's like the portrait I'm trying to get as I'm looking at their body with them. But just to not to ramble on, because I'm definitely rambling at this point, but I also really
Love the
appreciate
ramble.
the physicality of photography is very different from poetry. Like being in the street with your gear, your body is alive, you've got to move, and it almost is like everything is getting poured into this viewfinder, right? And like and time changes, it stretches or it's really fast, and for me I will crawl, climb, kneel to get an image, to get a perspective that I'm trying to do that on the page. But at the end of the day, I'm not like bathing in salts and like icing my back, you know what I mean? Like, or I've my jeans are scraped or something, and I've been carrying 10, 20 pounds. I've got lenses, I've got I've got extra batteries. I got to have my memory cards. I've got one around my neck. It's like, I really, really love the physicality of photography. It's like, it's something that, I need that. Whereas poetry, it's embodiment, sure, and the body is engaged, but usually the body is stationary, or maybe you're standing or something, but you're not certainly swiveling around, craning, you know what I mean? And then the moment of two, if you're turning your lens towards somebody, and that intimacy and engagement, no matter how quick it is, you're seen, they see you, you see them, and then what is going to happen in the gaze, right? And I think it's really profound when Black people see other Black people behind the camera. That's different. That's really different. And that's something that I'm always going to be after and involved, and like means everything to me. There's so many moments where people aren't used to Black people being behind the camera, certainly not a Black woman. So I think there's also something in that. I'll stop there.
Well, you brought up a lot for us to dig into. Just to stick with portraiture for 1 second, Rachel, you pointed out that both of you make self-portraits, and I'm interested, and you also both write about yourselves. What's the how would you compare writing about yourself to making a picture of yourself? When I write about myself, I find it to be very vulnerable. Is it a similar vulnerability when you're making a picture of yourself?
I think making a picture of myself is scarier. Just going back to the immediacy, but also too, like, I'm entranced by how revisionary or lyrically incorrect the memory can be. And most of the time when I'm writing about myself, it's like a few years have passed, if not a decade or two. So it makes me feel like I'm easing into the subject of myself. Whereas as soon as that lens, as Rachel was saying, is on you, there's an instant either exchange or tension or thrill, and trying to focus from a photographic standpoint on myself is much more distracting. I start to think about, other aspects of my life, and I kind of get taken out of the moment. So I have to have a bourbon or two before I take a picture of myself. But yeah, I think it's the slipperiness. I'm used to the slipperiness of writing that I hit on before, even when writing about the self. And I think that's in some ways comforting to me. And I've always been pretty frightened though by how my voice sounds in audio and how I look on screen and all that. So maybe that's where I'll be exploring soon and do some more self-portraits. But yeah.
Yeah, it's really terrifying to turn the camera on yourself. I think it took me many, many years to arrive at that point. I mean, it's not like I never try, but I just, in some way I wouldn't make that public. It was kind of like drafts in a way, until I got to a point where I really felt like this is your inability to kind of be in your body is happening in the poems, and it's happening in the photography. It's happening like widespread. And what is it about? And I think there were things that I wanted to explore, that I couldn't necessarily have a model do or explain to them. Some models I've worked with for many years, we kind of just were symbiotic and they get it. But there's a whole different thing to be the author of the image, and then you're looking at yourself in this way, and it's very vulnerable. And yet I think there's a thing about like time and memory that Marcus brought up, where I think after my mother died, I suddenly, just before she died, I had started to really formally make self-portraits of myself, and I was interested in Black womanhood and nature and the American South and, so many different things. And I think, even though you think, oh, there's the intimacy of a single lens, and I'm controlling it. No one is making my image of myself but me. there's a power in that, but there's also terror because it isn't one lens on you. Suddenly the lenses of the world are all in that single lens and you're aware of it, you know, and I think this is a very sensitive thing, particularly so for with women in photography, of like how we frame ourselves and how we resist that. And sometimes for me, I remember very vividly being down in Mississippi or Georgia or somewhere by myself and setting up my tripod and having this kind of wireless shutter that I would have under my foot or hit it in my hand or sometimes a timer. And you know sometimes I was in front of the camera for an hour posing. I don't know, it felt more like ritual. It doesn't really feel like pose per se. And I realized after an hour I hadn't even hit the button. It was like I was just trying to even understand who is watching you, who have you internalized watching you, and pulling that apart. And it just that happens differently in a poem, and I think the things Marcus said are really right about memory and that kind of cropping and burning that memory can do, which is different in a photograph. The thing too with photographs, particularly if we're working digitally, which I mostly am these days, is that there's like post-production. Even with the self-portraits, I try not to retouch
Right.
them. I try to let them be like unprocessed, but at the same time, it's edited, it's a construct. And so it's at one moment it's a construct, but then it's at the same time, I can look at these pictures now, for example, of the images I made right before, like hours before I realized that I had to get on a plane because my mother was dying. And then the images I made where I'm looking at the same body, but I look at my face and everything, and all I'm looking for is for my mother. It's like I'm just not even my own body anymore. It's like I'm trying to remember her and keep her there and think she's in me. So it's like all of these kind of questions that happen. But I think we're after these questions sometimes in our poems. And I like this word, slippery. It is slippery. Um, you have to have some reality to have a photograph, and I think the kind of reality that you assemble and construct in a poem is very slanted often, and it's different. The reality of that is different, even the making of it.
Thank you. Rachel, you used the word edited, right? And I see some commonality in language between the two forms, right? Composition is a word that I've heard photographers use, and obviously composition is like the arrangement of words on the page. The composition is the arrangement of image of the elements of a photograph. It strikes me also that a certain type of poetry is made of image, and obviously photographs are images. Could you talk a little bit about how composition in a photograph compares to composition in the composition of a poem, or even like what you look for? How does what you look for when you're making a photograph compare to what you're looking for when you're making a poetic image? I hear you both saying that there's often an immediacy to the photographic image, but I imagine you have something in mind that when you see it, you're ready to make the photograph. And then we're going to go to audience question came in, so we'll go to that next.
Composition. I think, there's a giant similarity for me in both photography and poetry when it comes to composition or placement of subjects. I'll just call it that. Because I think often in the poems that I love the most as a reader, that I've read 100 times, they will use a photographic compositional approach, like called the rule of thirds, to where spatially there are other things happening that are the secondary subjects or the subtopics. And for some reason, there's a magic place where, broken into thirds, the frame will give you an intersection point, and then it'll just kind of subconsciously leap out at the viewer. Poems do that too, with their main subjects sort of being hidden a couple lines in, or maybe being held from the reader until 3-4 lines from the end. And I think what that does for me as a reader and a viewer is it sets up what seems to be the stakes. And just like in life, the stakes always change. They intensify, they evolve, they devolve, their identity shifts. And I think that I'm trying to get, both in poems and photos, obviously you want that immediate connection between audience and the piece of art, but I want there to be a path toward rewarding the closer look or the extended look or looking at something a few times. And I don't think that could happen if the title of something is the entire subject and the first line is the entire subject and the whole poem focuses on that subject. I think other things need to jump in and surprise us, and in some ways maybe even contend with what the first subject that's presented was doing, and either have an exchange or a confrontation. And that's what I'm trying to do, like within the form of a poem, on the page or within the frame of the camera.
I think, to use labels for a minute, I would say like I'm a lyric poet and a lyric photographer. So sound is something, rhythm is something I try to have present in my photographs, though, photographs do not contain sound, right? I mean, the form doesn't contain sound. It has to be visualized in a way. Whereas poems, they're spoken, they are to be spoken, right? I mean, and so the attention for me in poems, really the rhythm, the lyric, how I'm going to breathe, like how do I breathe in photographs? How do I show the subject's breath or lack of, or, the energy of the landscape or the sound, like the movement, the sound, how language is kind of moving. And I think I often think about, photographs and in a kind of lyric way that I might approach a poem, and how kind of the enjambment, twist or stops or wraps around. And then like, how does that happen in an image? Can it happen in an image? I just, I'm trying to hold on to your question, Ian, and it's like all this stuff is flying around me. But I also think about negative space, and I appreciated what Marcus was saying too about the thirds, right? But I also feel, I mean, and this is, a third can be negative space, like negative space happening, whether that's in the spokenness of a poem, of like silence or breath, or the beat or something in the poem, the negative space that is surrounding the poem, or may bleed through the language of the poem, of what's not said in the poem, but that's there too. And that's that closer looking too that Marcus was talking about in the image, that contending with like that extended look and engagement with the image, to see the image in front of you, but to also assemble a narrative or story or the voices that come into the genesis of how that image got saved out of a continuum of images that are still surfacing in the action of the history and memory of the moment. Someone standing on the corner, someone crossing the street, someone sitting on the bus and they just turn their head. And did you see them your picture is them just turning their head? It's like, or there's no figure in the image. There's no subject, but there is a subject, and there's always a subject because there's always an author, whether that's the photographer or the poet, there is a human presence there. And so why might I focus of the shadow of a window on the ground, and then like the shadow of the window on the ground in a poem? What is that? What is that? How does that happen differently? Because I'm saying window, I'm saying shadow, but the photograph is going to do something that the language is doing differently. And then the last thing I'll say is like, I was thinking exactly of this word Marcus said, confrontation. And then I'm thinking, I feel like maybe years ago, Yusuf has said something about celebration and confrontation with like poetry. I think there are a lot of things that are nuanced in between that spectrum and everything like that. But, I think it can certainly weigh in as far as both poetry and photography. And I'll stick to photography, but also, as someone who paints and does sculpture and three-dimensional things, I think this probably affects uh, it makes me trouble and resist an easy binary between like this is the poem and this is the photograph, because I also like to rip up photographs and paste them or reassemble them or edit them and like really distort them, because they are a manipulation in some way of the reality or the perception by me. And so to be deliberate about that and to make it more intense, that happens in poems. We deliberately select and sift a narrative and an experience through language and rhythm and silence and image. Um, I never get tired. I'm always excited and challenged by this kind of work. It gives that thing that is that mysterious, not mystery exactly, but this kind of wonder that happens in the poem where that turn, I don't know if it's a turn, if we could call it that happens in the photograph but also in the poem, that you keep coming back to the poem and you're arriving at a different spot every time, but you have to keep going back because it's doing something so imperfect and human that it's inexplicable. And I think something happens with photography though that's very visceral and immediate, and that space that is outside of language, something happens with your eye and your body as you're looking at an image, period. Like it's again, I guess the word immediacy is something that happens, whereas there's going to be some work and some collaboration with a reader in a certain way, where there are things at stake for the reader that the poet has to offer and provide and craft and do their work with the language. So that's some of the things I would say.
Let's take one quick audience question, and then all this talk about your work, both poetic and photographic, is making me want to engage with it, hear it, and see it. So we'll move into the reading shortly. The first audience question that came in was, would each of you talk about the practice of ekphrasis with regards to your own photographs? By which, how do you take that question? Are you?
Love that
you
question.
unmuted, Marcus, so I assume you're ready.
Yeah, I love that question. I only just now tried to write in concert with a photo for the very first time about a month ago, and it was so difficult. And I realized the first couple photos that I chose were not quite as abstract or in full use of negative space as they could be, in order to provide me a proper opportunity to add something via text. So I had to step back and specifically choose a more abstract or ambivalent photo or main subject within the photo. And I think what came about was a different poetic voice than I've been using in the past. And it was really thrilling, but extremely baffling. In terms of like writing an ekphrastic poem about another artist's piece of art, I continue to do that. I love it. I've always loved it. Because there's that instant sense of being teleported into a space with an artist that may have passed away, that may be separated by you or separated from you by like cultural or nationalistic or governmental constraints. And you can kind of take on a new kinship or a new brief relationship with the artist and really think about things in light of their perspective in that piece of art. Or you can just latch on to a detail within the piece that some other viewer probably would have noticed but overlooked a little bit, and really just give that unheralded aspect of the work a little bit more attention, and change some viewers' experience with the piece, or give another verse, right, to the viewer's experience. But doing it with my own work is, I'm very new to it, and it's very difficult.
Rachel, I know the poems and the photographs and seeing in your collection, seeing the body speak to one another, right? Did you view that as ekphrasis?
I have ekphrastic poems in Seeing the Body, with Louise Bourgeois, Alberto Burri, and I feel like there's someone else that I love writing, like Marcus, I love writing ekphrastic poems. That's always just been like one of my lifelines. And, in Seeing the Body, I feel like the photographs are cavities in the body of my grief, and in my own body, that it's like the language is in the same body, and these are also organs, these photographs. And so there's a way that I'm hoping that is very lyrical and associative, where the photographs are doing a different work that language can't do, or couldn't do for me in the process of my grieving. I do sometimes interact with my own images, but only if I can make it interesting, and only if it's really, I guess it's like the impulse or the intention. Like if I make a self-portrait and then write about the self-portrait, it has to be doing something the image can't do, or I never want to feel like I'm writing to tell the narrative of the image or this or that. I think it's interesting sometimes to note how something got made. That's a story, right? Like a Genesis story. But I can be, depending on the material, reluctant to really have explanatory. I don't really like my own language around my own photographs. It feels like a little John Malkovich energy. Like, it's like kind of weird and redundant. And so that's the thing, I guess, whatever I write about my image would have to resist the redundancy, and really offer, again, like a different voice, right? What I am grateful for, and Iain, I'm calling you out, in your first book, you wrote what I feel is an ekphrastic poem about the experience of watching me photograph two Cave Canem brothers. So what I really like, which is happening when people send me things and they've written about one of my photographs, or they're writing poems to the photographs or essays or something like that, is like something else happens and I can engage my own image in a different way. But it's very interesting. It's like when someone's reading your poems and they say, well, it means this to me, and I saw this and I saw that, right? Like they're looking at the foreground, or they're looking at this. And I don't want to say whether that's true or that's not it, unless it's like something really way off, like, oh yeah, no, I actually have clothes on, don't, but like, it's like stuff like that. But it's like, I don't, I just want to give that negative space to the reader or to the viewer, or to the writer, who is going to also see things in the image that, because I made it or I'm in it, that wasn't part of the visibility and how the thing got made. Like I can't see it, a 360 perspective. And then as more time goes by too, I start to lose some of the stories of where was I, what date was that, when were, what else was going on in my life. And so I like the collaboration with others, when they may look at images and now be in a space of language that I don't need to be in that moment,
Very cool.
But I think I always will be engaged, in the space of ekphrasis work. And I like to kind of invert it and distort it and, make it convex. And I also, in my mixed media stuff, I often have language, fragments of poems that I paint or different things. So I don't have it compartmentalized in a certain kind of way. Like if I feel like writing over on top of a photograph or tracing or putting something else on top of it, I will. And so that's a kind of writing to me. That's making like a new written response or something to something I may have done in the past. So
Thank you.
great question. Thanks for it.
I think I'm going to jump into the reading and presentation of some photographs of yours. Just to make sure we have ample time for both of you, I think I'm going to skip the bios if it's okay with you. I know you both are readily, you live very public lives. Folks can find you on the internet. So we'll get started with Rachel. The only part of the bio I will include is Seeing the Body. Came out last year. One of the books that got me through the pandemic. Beautiful, as came up, has photographs and poems in it together. Rachel has a novel on the way called Promise, and she lives in Brooklyn. Rachel, we'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Iain. I at this point in our conversation, it feels so it's like, oh yeah, show photographs and read some poems, but I'm happy to do that. And let's see, I'm going to share screen. So as I mentioned before, what I'm going to do is pretty much just show photographs from Seeing the Body today. I'm not going to speak. It's like 2 minutes or so of something I put together that I've been sharing from the book. So it will play for 2 minutes or so, and then I will read poems. I just, in my snarky way, I don't like reading over my images. Later, if people have questions or things like that, I'm happy to speak about the images, a specific image, or talk about the story or the energy of it. But I don't necessarily want to like read poetry over it. So maybe I can talk about some of the images while they're coming up. So I'm sharing the screen. Hope you can see it. Here we go to the beginning here. Can you see it? Yeah, thank you, Marcus. Great. So what I can tell you about the photographs is that these are series, most of them from, I would say roughly 2014, 2015, 2016. Seeing the Body, the book itself, is a celebration of my mother's life after she died in 2014, and a transformation of my own life as a daughter, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a Black woman in this country. And many of the pictures that you're seeing were taken in the Deep South. This picture you're seeing, the first art residency I had after my mother died was at Yaddo. And it just felt really dissociative for me. I pretty much didn't write that much there. I mostly took photographs. This is an image from Sardis, Mississippi, just outside of Oxford. And most of these images, I'm alone with a tripod and a wireless remote. Almost all of them that you're seeing today are digital. I do like to work with a Rolleiflex, but a lot of these were digital. This was a kind of praise ritual I did in some fields in the South. I would kind of go and dance and just take pictures and figure out later what the thing was, but it's also the moment and the rhythm of being in touch. This image was taken just after 9 Black people were murdered in Charleston in church. It was a kind of elegy image. This is where I finished Seeing the Body at the Robert Rauschenberg kind of property in Captiva, Florida. I'm very, very influenced by Robert Rauschenberg's work because he experimented. This was New Mexico and Santa Fe, New Mexico. I think the poet Natalie Diaz helped me with this, this particular shoot. And this is another picture from Yaddo. I guess maybe almost a year after my mother died, actually maybe less than that. This again is from Santa Fe. And I talked to you about, the physicality of the work and, climbing up into this volcanic rock structure. By the time I got to it, I have a wireless remote. I think Natalie was there to make sure I didn't fall out of these rocks and die. But, I was soaked in sweat. I was crying. It was just a really vulnerable thing. And this marked the 1-year anniversary of my mother's passing. And so trying to stay in the world, as they say, I saw these rocks and they have a feeling of a womb. And although the image is black and white, in the reality, the sky above was like this bright, bright blue. And yet the sky, in a different vantage point, there were like these really, really wild, intense desert thunderstorm that was happening. And so you could look at the expanse of sky and see, kind of all these different things happening at one time. So these are the images that, I'm going to share just because they're the most closely related to seeing the body. And now I'm trying to figure out how to stop share. And so I'm going to read you some poems. Wait, Ian, are we supposed to read poems right now too, or just show pictures? Okay, great. So what happened with seeing the body is that the image that you saw in the photograph became the cover of the book. And that, it's this thing that we all spoke about as far as, kind of ekphrasis or collaborating with yourself. This was the first time in my life that I really just thought, I want this all to be together, and I want it to be as messy as grief is, as complicated and hard as grief can be, but also, joy and love. One of the things in the book that was critical to me was not to just say my mother's gone, she died, but also like, I'm alive, I'm here. And I'm here because of the great love she gave me and that we gave each other, being daughters and being friends. And then thinking of the women in my life who, we mother each other, we care for each other. So I'm going to just start with the title poem, which is called Seeing the Body. Seeing the body. She died and in the spring of her blood, I remember my mother's first injury. Surprise of unborn petals curling red, then dark around her wrist. Some fruit she cut, some onion, some body with skin and sharp seeds. She fed me. She lived us and I. She held we and I. She kept speaking with those flowers falling from her blood, taking her across the sky to death. I remember her voice like a horn I never want to pull out of my heart. In the next life, which is here and here, I gather every mouth that ever sang my mother's blues. She burned and she talked back hard at God. Oh, my mother, she danced unbroken too. Bale of grief on my back, opening into something black I wear. A life of flesh like a petal or fruit or burning. I've carried everything and I'm tired. My mother survived and but she did not live. She told me nothing and she was waiting the entire time. How does the elegy believe me? Together, we crossed the sky. There was a gate and we walked through the world like that. She wrote we and she was last or never seen. And brown eyes without life, opened her eternity when the air in her stopped and She was last seen dying. She was too silent for the first time in her life. The spring of my mother's blood, hot in God, the dark, dark, beyond the closed door that won't move again. Comedy. I am here before the nurse brings my mother breakfast. I study her body, try to remember if I caught my mother in the dream I had the night before, where the hem of her gown flew through a silver tunnel without end. Her skin went right through my hands whenever I was close enough to save her. She slipped through her name I could not stop calling until I sat up alone in my crib. Embarrassed, she tells me she remembers how she phoned me last night to let me know she was in the morgue. She laughs as the nurse, whose feet squeak in Minnie Mouse Crocs, arrives with tea. We watch the nurse with eyes that will never remember her face. Thank her for the toast that is thicker than my mother's hands. That morphine is some powerful shit, my mother says. I agree with her, as though she has merely mentioned it is cold outside, though I have rarely had morphine and have never made courtesy calls from a morgue. It was late, and I didn't know where I was, she says, because that wasn't death, which means I couldn't have called you from that place. This is my new mother, who has finally admitted fear into the raw ward of her heart. This is my mother, who flew away from my grasp in the tunnel without end. The woman who could not wait for me to grab the white edge of where she was going. I was afraid, she says. Looking over the rim of her plastic cup, she shakes the world, chipped ice between us. Yeah, don't go and write about me like that, she says. I already know you will. And I think I have time to have maybe one more. So I'll read this poem, Good Mother, to close. And I think I'm reading it because it's spring and it's almost Mother's Day, and it's just I never feel jaded. I never feel like, oh, I survived that. It feels like it just rips my skin off all over again. But this poem is about the kind of celebration and joy and the things when people see you and see you're in pain and see you're grieving, and how they can arrive and hold you until you can hold yourself again and see yourself again, because you almost feel like you've disappeared sometimes in the chasm of your grief. And I just want to say, like, we're in a time where grief is really real, and the ways that we are trying to grieve, the ways we are asked not to grieve, are going to have a profound effect on us and the children who are coming, who have a lot of grief, a lot of things we can't explain to them. And their truthfulness and honesty and sincerity in the questions they're asking us is just, I think about it often, of how the grief is going to manifest. Good mother. Praise the woman who took me in her arms and wouldn't let go of me. We sank to the floor in the middle of the aisle in Rite Aid. It was a late morning, and I walked slowly, furious that spring could still be so wonderful. Magnolia tempted me to forget about my mother for a few minutes. I stared at a Brooklyn blue sky through branches clasping pear blossoms. The limbs shook in sunlight. My eyes adjusted when I went into the pharmacy and realized everywhere I looked, the world announced it would soon be Mother's Day. Something ripped itself out of me, a howl so wide I thought I would burst. The woman near the counter understood right away. The way my mother once understood I had been born in a specific sadness. The woman did not say she was a mother, but I knew it. She put her arms around me and waved away the cashiers, the security guard who repeated, "Ma'am, ma'am." A stranger rocked me in her arms, so much kindness as we fell over and crashed against a row of votive candles. She didn't say it would be okay, but she didn't ask me what was wrong. But her arms put me in a vicious prayer. I almost bit her, almost pushed her away. We held on. We held on and praised the nameless thing that makes us what we think we aren't strong enough to know. She knew. She didn't let go of me. Praise the woman who didn't wipe my snot from her shirt, my tears from her collarbone, who did not tell me to pull myself together while everything inside me dropped. Crushed bones, blossoms pushing through my mouth, a word, mom, mom, mom. This broken birdsong of mine, with no bird, no wing, no way to fly back through time. Praise the woman who did not leave me like something suddenly dead on the sidewalk with a breeze blowing over its face. Praise the woman who smelled like fabric softener and coffee and the good things I must believe I am too. Praise the mothers who walk slowly through the world, bringing children into themselves, burying children sometimes before themselves, and who defend something harder than innocence. Praise the guts and grace of mothers. Praise their exhaustion and their good work. Praise their wit, their wonderful ways of listening to the world fall asleep against its clean pillow. For the woman who knelt with me in an ugly heap in the middle of Rite Aid on an unbearable spring day, who helped me buy a Mother's Day card for my dead mother, who knew better than to say I'd be just fine. For you, I lift my arms each spring and wish you a kindness so fantastic. I sometimes feel I'm in midair, the shadow of my wings, clapping in joy above your children who must love you. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you, Rachel. I've heard that poem several times, and all those poems several times, especially that last one gets me every time. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful, powerful reading. And it was great to see your photographs after hearing you talk so much about them, the physicality of, especially the last shot. That's the cover shot to the book, really. I was struck again by how much work you had to do for that. Thank you. Next up is Marcus Jackson. This is his most recent, Pardon My Heart. He lives in Columbus, Ohio, and is a professor at a university that likes to get knocked out in the first round of the tournament there. We did have one question from a friend of ours come in, Marcus, that maybe you can weave into your reading. A London-based gentleman would like to know what your preferred choice of bourbon is.
I mean, I stay drinking working class brands of liquor, but I really like the Double Oak Woodford Reserve right now. I want to say thank you to Rachel. I'm always stunned by your photos and your poetry. I think I'll start with a mother, a photo of a mother or an aunt. And then I'll run through some of these photos and just talk about maybe the setting or how they occurred. And then I'll read like 5 or 6 poems. This photo, are we all good with the screen share? Can we see? This photo was from, we're good. This photo was from, I think it was the first week of June in 2020. And it was in the middle of about a 22 day stretch of nonstop rallies and protests and a lot of physical confrontations with the police. And on a Saturday, there was a stretch of rallies that featured families, and there were a lot of families there. And I was walking up this main street, and I first noticed this child on the left with the sign, and I stopped. And this person over here, who I take to be their mother or guardian or family member, was getting these other 2 children out of the car so that they could be a part of everything. And all I was really trying to do was frame the primary subject right here to get kind of what I was hitting on with about the rule of thirds, to get this intersection that just kind of jumps out at the eye with the sign. And in the very last half second, this child in the middle peeked out and gave what is my favorite expression of the entire photo. And I was kind of waving a little bit as I was framing things at the youngest child, and the youngest child reached out to me a little bit. And it just ended up being one of the photos of the summer for me. Just the difference in expressions and the joy of free speech and publicly being ourselves. I think this next photo, yes, this is from like a day or 2 after, when a bunch of protesters were reclaiming the streets from the police, and there was a coordinated like sectioning off of this really big intersection in Columbus, Ohio. And I had gotten, as the formation was starting, I had gotten close-ups of all the signs just to document all of the political statements and statements toward justice that were happening. And as I was crossing the street to actually leave the scene, this car pulled up and this person rose out of the sunroof and put their fist up. And I think I'd changed the aperture from like 8 to 2.8 because I wanted the political statements to take on a blurriness, because I mean, it saddens me that we have to say the same things over and over and over again, and we still keep getting attacked. And I wanted to focus on what looks to be the ascension of spirit or statement when it comes to the subject here. This happened about a month after, when, I mean, we were just feeling really devastated over the summer. And I remember this was a Friday, and I took my camera out just trying to escape the news and maybe take some street portraits. And I came across this group of kids who had a full drum set and were dancing, and one of their parents was there just kind of coordinating and looking out for them. But they were doing some choreographed dance moves, some freestyling. This kid on the drums was mind-blowing. And I was crouching, I think, and there's like the shrubbery on the curb. I was crouching in the shrubbery, and I wanted to get this heart on this child's shirt and the memorial mural for George Floyd kind of in the center. And then I was just waiting for whoever stepped up to do their individual dancing to get to a moment in one of their moves where I would still be able to see basically everybody's face. And luckily, she hit her move and the focus came through. And then they just took turns. And this was one of my favorite moments of the summer. And I ended up, this was the photo I ended up writing a poem for, just because the narrative is less conclusive than some of the other poems or some of the other photos. And I just love the expression right there. This was a moment where I was just walking down the street and this person in the all black, this is a Sunday, like right after church. And I wasn't going to church, church was letting out. And I was walking down the street taking photos and they called me over and said, "Hey, cameraman, come get a photo of me and my brother." And they're really just great friends. And he was graduating in the back there in the white shirt. He had just graduated high school. And they were celebrating. They got a bottle of Hennessy. And I remember framing this. I just wanted to get the information in the back because I was having flashbacks to the 90s because the Newports were still so prominent. This person has a Death Row shirt on, Death Row record label. And it was just like time cycling back. And the only thing I think I remember trying to do, I wanted to get some smoke in the air in that photo. And then here, this is another case where I was walking around campus and this person saw me with my camera and they're a former boxer. So they came up to me and they were like trying to get shots mid-jab. They wanted pictures mid-jab. And then we just started talking a little bit. And I was like, "Let me just get a portrait of you. Stand there while we're talking." And they said, "Fine." And we moved over. It was busy all around us. So we took a step into this little bus stop canopy. And then here, another bus stop. This was just what you would consider like more of a traditional street photo where I'm passing a scene and I just kind of snap something quickly. What I could see from very far away was that this child was holding an adult purse that originally caught my attention. And then what ended up coming into the frame, and sometimes you don't even notice or care to notice things like this while you're actually out there. This is a place where major gentrification is happening. So they are residents who, unfortunately, will probably be priced out of their own neighborhood soon. And I wanted to catch some of that turmoil that I felt, and it ended up having a secondary subject. And then I was just outside the Department of Education, and I saw a Black person and a white person, and there was actually a wedding across the street behind us. And I went up to them and I was telling them that the photographer at the wedding is not a good photographer, and they started laughing. And then I just asked them if I could take their portrait, and they said yes. And then here we have someone who's formerly homeless, and there's this wonderful organization downtown Columbus that when you register with them, they will give you a number of copies of these street speech papers and free of charge, and you can sell them and take donations as long as you're registered, and you can see all his credentials here. But this isn't a really posh part of the downtown area, and the cover of the newspaper said it all for me. This is when we were getting towards the end of the summer and just trying to look how to recover. And then this is just a street portrait. I'm just still in love with this person's expression. And they stopped me and they were like, "Take my picture." And then we started talking a little bit, and we were talking about church and family and everything. And I was just waiting until I got an expression that was not like posed. And I said something, she agreed, and then that was the expression that I got. So I'll unshare and read a few poems now. I'll read two poems from my last book, Pardon My Heart. I'll read these two, I think, because they're a nice little microcosm. One's an infatuation, head over heels and love poem, and then the other one is a breakup poem. This one's called Again. Again, cross the floorboards with that walk of yours, the one that's more psychology than body. Again, tell me about before we met, when you slept less than the wind, when you rode the same night bus until the sky lost its opacity. Have I told you yet how I've been fine with dying since the first morning I woke to you peering out the window, drinking coffee in your underthings? Sometimes when you leave, the room gapes and the sounds of the house harshen, and your distance is a bare dish gathering dust. Again, let's take a plane somewhere known for heavy rain spells. We'll sit outside, barefoot, beneath an eave, and not talk, watching the falling water like an endless set of instrument strings trembling. And then here's a breakup poem. It's called Travel Plans. All these nights, I've been telling you things, mainly made up things, aiming for your wonder and empathy and lust. And this has worked well enough. What with you glimmering to others about my victories and complexities? What with us waking bare-fleshed while mornings blared light through the shadeless panes? But I'm talked out now. And the reach of requisite is suddenly so fraught within you. Your eyes looking breakably at me. Your parted mouth, the bay your former voice won't find. And I'm leaving. Maybe for a bar or a bus station, cheap drinks alone, or a slow third-class ride to another unremarkable town where someone else's face will, in a half-second glance, give me the thrilling disinterest I need. And I'll read 3 poems from a book I'm currently working on. This is a ghazal, the Persian form. The refrain word is night. One of my favorite words in the language. What a fire. My therapist has approved my drinking of 3 whiskeys per night. Her eyes forbearing, knowing well the ruthlessness of night. The son having fled as a father might flee, my cousin fathered a narrow terror while he robbed with a pistol a fellow citizen one night. The encouraging lies of a mother are greatly underpaid job keepers. Slovenly kings have dealt much wrong money to generals and knights. My childhood was a lengthy scene of make-believe and disaccord. My favorite things being rain and watching my mother's cigarettes ignite. What a fire among its timelessness and musculature is not more divine when burning past the open gates of night. In this poem, I wanted to write about how tragically easy it is as a person of color to get entangled in the justice system in a very, very young age. This is called Young Monk. I knew a boy named Sean whose mother loved successive men that charmed and tortured her. One day in 9th grade, Sean brought a luminous hunting knife to lunch and put it near the throat of the dean, who had always seemed the wryest, most unmovable force as he supervised and distrusted us for no other reason than the fact that we were darker and more angelic than he. Sean, breaking a bit of skin on the side of the dean's neck, soon got choked by the officer assigned the daily patrol of our hectic first floor halls. Institutions later absorbed Sean, and I wrote him some letters each year, letters of update about certain classmates and kin, letters in which it felt impossible to plant much truth or redemption, my hand and pen pausing abundantly the blank paper like a mute field I wandered, and somewhere beyond, upon a hill that rose above roads and foliage, my friend lived like a young monk made to study decades in some state-funded monastery built in praise of the godlessness of pain. And I'll close with this poem, which is in some ways an ode to solitude. I've always found solitude to be one of the most rejuvenating, revelatory things in my life, even though people tend to warn you against it. This is called A Loneliness So Pure. The world encouraged me to complete my doctorate in shamelessness. You'll hurt to not be part of all this interface and commerce, I was warned. Though, as soon as I declined, I was rewarded with a loneliness so pure that my ears could not be found by bothersome words. And my blood felt fed only by the air and the light that lives beneath the glass of greenhouses. My family, my former lovers, and the authorities tried to talk to me, to sway me toward buildings whose entrances have stern signs. But I gazed patiently at everybody's face, each lit from the same failing fire, and I left them speechlessly, my movements constituting a new species of worryless wind. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. That line, built in praise of the godlessness of pain, like maybe when prisons are museums, we should put that on a plaque near all of them. Thank you so much. It was great to hear your new work, and it seems timely and engaging with some of the issues we need to engage with right now. And you said that thing, we keep saying the same thing and like nothing happens. For how long can you say the same thing? But I guess we got to keep fighting. All right. That brings us to the end of the program. There was one other question that was left over. We have about 3 minutes. Do you quickly want to talk about framing that came in? What would you say are the related considerations of framing a poem and framing a photograph? What's left in? What's left out of the shot? Any quick thoughts there?
I guess I could start. I mean, I tend to find myself in poems shortening them. And the first or second draft, I tend to find myself shortening them. Because I think going back to what Rachel said, when it comes to lyric and sound, those generally tell me the sounds of the poem and the sound patterns or the deviations from the sound patterns towards the end of a poem tell me when the poem's gonna end or when it needs to end. Photographically, because I'm usually on the street with tons of information and possibility, I tend to work just with one focal length, and the lens sort of leads me to what, just like my distance from the subject, it eliminates some of the things I could include in the frame. But usually I want to get, if I'm on the street taking a photo, I want to get some type of landmark or city specific, place specific information or subtopic or texture. And once I decide what the subject is, then I essentially kind of balance the frame around them and then take a slight step back or a slight step closer or tilt a little bit to include that secondary setting information and just hope that it works out.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about framing, and I think, you know, to draw one bridge I might sketch out between the two forms is the the importance of the title in the poem as far as the frame. I find I'm very reluctant to title photographs for some reason. I don't, I have several photographs. They must have like 8 different names each. It's just, they don't stick, you know? And I guess I'm not interested until I really formally have to title it. And, you know, maybe if someone is buying the photograph or something, and then it has to be like authenticated and all this kind of stuff. Then there's a title, right? But I feel like the energy and work and impulse of the title and its relationship to the content of the poem and the rhythm of the poem is pretty important in terms of framing. And I think I tend in photographs not to center things. It's usually off. Like I rarely have this kind of thing. It's usually here or it's here, or, you know, I'm very interested, like Marcus, in kind of landscape or a kind of anchor of location and geography. Um, in the photos I showed, you know, my body, my self-portrait is framed by the landscape, is really critical of where I was and the variety and strangeness of the landscapes in relationship to my body and grief. So those are some things I might say about framing.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much today about, I have so much food for thought in terms of like immediacy, that rule of thirds applying to both photographs and poems is definitely something I'm going to take with me when I next sit down at the desk. I appreciated the conversation. I could see, you know, I could sit here all afternoon chopping it up with you guys about this stuff, but you know, we need to take a little break. So some of you will be staying on with us at 3 o'clock. There's a workshop. I'll walk you through it. Rachel and Marcus have picked out some images for you to write about. We'll do some generative work around ekphrasis for the question that came up. Really quickly, Bethany has a bunch of great programming this month. I'm really happy to be about 10 minutes away from all this. There's an exhibit called To Pablo Neruda with Gratitude, with art by Rachel Udell, and a really sweet exhibit called Lado a Lado, Side by Side, a celebration of literature and art by children at the Ossining Children's Center here, which is like a nursery school and also has some pre-K classes. So if you're in the Westchester, New York, or New York City area and want to come up the Hudson River a little bit, 2 great exhibits. There's some public programs that I believe are online. There's some poets in residence, Erica Meitner and Jason Schneiderman are some names you might know. One of the other poets in residence is giving a generative ars poetica workshop on April 28th. Her name is Pashenda Bao, and all of the poets in residence are giving a reading on April 29th, and you can check those out at bethanyarts.org. It's a great center. It's a beautiful campus, and I'm really thankful to be, again, about 10 minutes away. So thank you again to Bethany. Thank you to Abby Lewis for having me. Thank you, Rachel and Marcus, for always going along with my harebrained themes. I appreciate you.
Yeah, that's cool.
Thank you, audience, for spending what is a beautiful spring day with us. We appreciate you being out there. Those of you in the workshop, we'll see you in about half an hour. Thank you.